I would like to welcome you to this first event in a day of recollection and celebration. This is the season of the 30th anniversary of the founding of this university, and coincidentally, the 30th anniversary of statehood for Alaska. My favorite mixed metaphor is this: he looked back down the untrodden paths of the future and saw the footprints of an invisible hand. That's what we're doing this morning. I am honored and pleased to introduce the Vice President of our Board of Trustees, Archbishop Francis Hurley, who is the moderator of this panel discussion entitled Alaska Pacific University, Our Past and Our Future. And Archbishop Hurley will introduce the other panelists. Archbishop Hurley.
Thank you. I welcome Pacific University. My personal history is with Alaska Pacific University and only a very short time with Alaska Methodist University. I was here for the change of names, which is also the time of the change of many things relative to higher education here in the state of Alaska. I think it is deeply appropriate that we celebrate the 30th anniversary of the university and the 30th anniversary of statehood at the same time, and indeed tonight it will be in the same forum. The development of any people is always intimately related to education. And we know that the leadership of any people, certainly in the history that we all know, is intimately linked with the education at the university and graduate level. Alaska Pacific University, formerly Alaska Methodist University, was an intimate part of the life of the state of Alaska. Its idea arose with the quest for statehood. It was, as you all know, the dream of Gordon Gould. And it's unfortunate that only by 1 year do we miss having him here to speak for himself about his dream. But as we read about him, we know that he had a dream that centered on leadership, particularly leadership for the native peoples of Alaska. He knew the need for education, and he had the personal commitment and industry to instill in others a realization that higher education must continue to spread and grow and increase in Alaska. We pay great tribute to Dr. Gould for his thoughtfulness, his industry, and his courage, and his unflagging dedication to higher education. When we link the anniversary of the university and the anniversary of the state together, I think we see the two deeply intertwined. And as we listen to our speakers this morning, I think we will understand this all the more, because all of them were part of the struggle for statehood and also were part of the growth of the infant state to be what it is today. We have 4 people with us who are really symbolic of the history of the university. They are also part of the reality of the history of the university. So both form and substance come together in them. As we reflect upon the role that our panel has had in the founding of the university, we might think for a moment of the philosopher Santayana, who said that if we forget the lessons of history, we are prone to make the same mistakes over and over again. We can also have a variation on that particular theme taken from a more recent book, that of Roots, which many of you I'm sure have read. And there was a little incident in the story of Roots that I think symbolizes what we are about today. Two of the characters who went all the way through that book and through the television series were Sam and Kizzy. They were very close. They grew up together. They suffered together. They worked together. They did so many things together. And at one point, Kizzy was asked why she never married Sam. And her response was, Sam never knew where he came from, and therefore he has no idea of where he should be going. And I could not marry a man like that. We do not think of this event as looking for pitfalls. I think rather we look at this event as a time for us to look to the future. And we are going to be able to look to the future with great hope and confidence if we understand well what our history and roots have been. And our four panelists today, I think, are uniquely qualified to give us that presentation. The first that I present to you is George Sharrock, known to most of you, I'm sure. I'm not going to go into any long explanation of the history of each of these people. I remember from my own days in speech class, the professor saying to the class, if you are introducing people, remember your role is to introduce. So, George Sharrock was mayor of Anchorage, and he was also a member of the Committee of 100. And that Committee of 100 was the central group that was responsible for taking the dream of Gordon Gould and bringing it into reality. So, George, I welcome you to the panel to to this group to give us your reflections on your involvement with the university in the years gone by. After he speaks, we will have each of the others speak, and then we will open the panel to discussion from the floor for everyone. So, George, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. It certainly gives me a great deal of pleasure to relate some of the things that happened back early in the days of AMU. I'm going to generally limit my remarks to those events that I remember that took place prior to 1959. And of course, they'll have to be summarized very briefly in the time limits that we have. About 39 or 40 years ago, there was a new road built south of Anchorage. That road was continued over the years and would eventually turn into the Seward Highway. A few miles south, about where Diamond Boulevard is, or somewhere in that neighborhood, there was a sign that was built on the west side of the road, and it read as follows: "This is the site of the Alaska Baptist College." Now, I had not heard any announcements, any publicity of this new college that was to be built. And over the next 3 or 4 years, I didn't hear anything. I'm sure that the congregation of that church knew what the plans were and when things might happen. But it wasn't general knowledge as far as I was concerned. The reason I'm mentioning this college is that it differed very greatly from the way that Gordon Gould brought into, or attempted to bring into reality, his dream that he'd had so many years. He came to the Anchorage Chamber of Commerce, and this was back in 1953. He made a very impassioned appeal to the Chamber of Commerce to help him get the Board of Missions of the Methodist Church to found a college in Alaska. I was on the board of directors of the Chamber of Commerce at that time. They accepted Gordon Gould's appeal very well. He was very enthusiastic in his approach, and it brought enthusiasm among those people who heard him. The Chamber of Commerce promised him that a committee would be formed to go further into this matter, and they did. there was a committee formed. There were maybe a half a dozen of us volunteered for the committee at that time. We made an approach to the Board of Missions, telling them of our interest and our desire to do something. And we received a reply saying that a delegation would be sent to Anchorage from the Board of Missions in a short time, and they would explain what had to be done. I think it was early in 1954 then when we got word that there would be a delegation coming. The delegation consisted of 3 people. One of them was Connie Snoke, who many of you know, who was the treasurer of the Board of Missions at that time. They quizzed us very closely, and we them for several days, and they finally told us what needed to be done in order to get the Board of Missions started on this project. They said that in order for a project of this size to take place, the initiative must come from the people living in the community, and therefore that we would need to prepare and put on a very large fund drive to raise at least $500,000 for the project. Well, this took us back just slightly. We were a little apprehensive about the amount. We hadn't figured that it would be anything like this. You understand that at that time, Alaska was only a territory. Anchorage was a relatively small town with a population of, I think, less than 60,000 people in the whole area. The Korean War had just ended, and it was expected that there would be a hiatus in the Defense Department expenditures in this area because the war was over and the crisis did not exist. So you can imagine that the economy wasn't really booming. Nevertheless, we told them that we were interested. We talked among ourselves about it. We said that this is an opportunity that comes but once in a lifetime and that we're just going to have to do something about it. So we went ahead and told them that we were serious, that we wanted to put on this fund drive, and they went back to Philadelphia, and we went to work trying to increase the size of our committee so that we could put this drive on. Now, this was in 1954, early 1954. We did attempt to get new members. Each one had to be sold individually on the merits of a college, private college in this area, and it took time. I think by the end of the summer, early fall, we had maybe only 50 people that we could count on who were really dedicated to the proposition. So we decided that this was not enough manpower to put on a drive of this kind. So we determined to get some super salesmen to help us to conduct the drive. So we called upon Jack Anderson and Lewis Simpson, who both qualified, in our opinion, as super salesmen. They agreed to take on the leadership of the drive. They immediately called it the Committee of 100. And over the next few months, all the best men and women in town that could be contacted were contacted and persuaded to become members of this committee. The organizational work of the committee went on then over the next few months. I was designated as publicity chairman. We designed a small brochure, really a 8-page folder, which attempted to explain why higher education facility was needed in this area, in this state, and all the points, all the values that the college would contribute to the community in the folder. These had high distribution. These folders were put in all the stores and every place that we could possibly put them, where people could pick up one and read what was happening. In other words, we were doing it a little differently than the Baptists had done. In addition to that, Augie Hebert, who had just started television, the first television station in Alaska, KTVA, offered to give us a half hour weekly for a program that would where we could promote both the college and the fund drive. I conducted these programs and was able to get knowledgeable people from the Committee of 100 and elsewhere to where we discussed all these values that we placed on a college that could be built here. This went on for several weeks, both before and during the fund drive. In addition to that, we had help from all the newspapers with articles about the college, radio announcements, and so forth, so that somewhere early in 1955 now we felt that we were getting ready to put on the drive, and we advised the Board of Missions that we were ready. They sent a man back who had previous extensive experience in raising college funds. He immediately went to work with our publicity committee, and we designed a larger brochure, one that was to be used by the solicitors when they called on prospects and for other distribution. Meantime, the Committee of 100 had done all the training that they felt was necessary, and this man from the Board of Missions offered his suggestions as to how to approach prospects for a college fund drive. So we finally got the fund drive underway in the spring of 1955, and it ran for several weeks, and we were very fortunate. We thought that we raised in the form of pledges, mostly pledges, over $700,000, almost $750,000. Simultaneous to this drive, the Board of Missions had encouraged many of the districts in the United States to put on drives in their churches for money for our college fund here. They sent up 36 people who came up. They were district superintendents of the Methodist churches in the United States, sent them up here to see what we were doing, how we were doing it, and we enthused them. And Gordon Gould, of course, was here, and he enthused them, and everyone gave them a real good picture of what we wanted to do and how we were going to do it, and what the college would be like and where it would be situated and so forth. They went back and did put on drives, which were fantastic in our opinion. Over the next few months, they raised, in the form of pledges again, several $1 million. I've been told that it was up as high as $4 million, but I've forgotten exactly. But you must understand that our drive and their drive did not bring in very much cash. The money was to be paid in the form of monthly installments and so forth on the pledges. So the money was not here to begin immediately the construction of a college. There was a lot of organizational work that needed to be done before, anyway. A board of trustees had to be nominated and appointed. There were 16, I think, altogether in the first board, 8 of them from Alaska and 8 of them from the other states. And I just might add that out of these 8 here, the 4 have already deceased. There were other things that had to be done. We had to apply for and get a nonprofit corporation charter from the state, from the territory, I should say. It wasn't state yet at that time. We had to get the corporation charter. We had to engage an architect who would lay out the campus and design the first buildings that were to be built. And most important of all was the acquisition of the land, which we did not yet have. And I think Dr. McGinnis will go into more detail on that, but it was very important that this land be attained, and that we were talking about our first choice, which is right here where we are now. I'd like to give you a little anecdote about this spot. Back in 1947 or 48, my son and I walked from town out to Campbell Airstrip, which most of you know is down southeast of town. The road running to the airport is just a few hundred feet from here, south of the campus now. And on our way back, we became intrigued with this mound, this hill that sits up here where your campus is now. So we decided to walk up there. But lo and behold, there wasn't a living tree on the whole area. There had been a forest fire in through here a few years earlier and burned down every tree. All that was left were blackened trunks, and half of them had fallen down and made a terrific job of walking up the hill. We got up to the top of the hill, very near to where the president's house now stands, and saw what a beautiful sight it was to the east, looking toward the mountain. And I said to my son, this would make a great place for a college or a hospital. And we searched around a little more there, and we found an old bunker, or dugout, I should say, that evidently had been built there during World War II, evidently to guard the approaches to the airstrip at Campbell Airstrip. Then we walked from there on back down through about where we are now and back to the road. The only reason I'm mentioning this is to give you a picture of what this campus looked like a little over 40 years ago. As I said, there was a lot of organizational work that had to be done yet and before we could really start building. And I think some of the following panel members will get into that. I would like to say how honored I have been, and how personal satisfaction I have gained of working for all. Very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Our next speaker is Katharine Crittenden. Katharine is known for her deep commitment to youth and to a sense of history. I think those two interests more than qualify her to give us another picture of Alaska Methodist University.
The past comes alive when one reflects upon how the events in the history of Anchorage and Alaska have affected the well-being of this state. In the early 50s, the quest for statehood, paralleled by the untiring efforts of those who saw a need for the establishment of a 4-year non-sectarian college in Anchorage, were indeed two such events. As a result, Alaska, this city, and university are equipped to face the future and reach for the stars. What was it that inspired our community over 30 years ago to work for the installation of a 4-year educational institution on 242 acres of virgin land 2.5 miles from the center of downtown Anchorage? Raising funds for anything was not one of the more popular activities then, any more than it is today. But there was something different about this project. I think it had to do with the personality, influence, and motivation of a quiet man of God, Gordon Gould. Mr. Gould spoke from the heart, out of his concern for the education of Alaskans in Alaska. During an early interview about the College Fund program, he said, "I have no fear for Alaska's future. Once the young people who are born, reared, and educated in Alaska take over the reins of its government, business, education, professions, and community life, Alaska will come into its own once it will be producing its own leadership." Dr. Gould spoke from personal experience. He was born in the Aleutians and raised in Alaska. All of his former education was received outside. When confronted with the critical questions, this leader never lost his cool. When he was asked what effect the establishment of a new college in Alaska might have upon the University of Alaska, he answered by saying there would be friendly competition that would prove beneficial to both institutions. Overall chairman of the fund drive was Arthur Waldron, a highly respected Methodist churchman and businessman in Anchorage. He was supported by a roster of citizens who made up his steering committee, and his finance chairman, Dr. Alexander Stewart. Anchorage citizens also served on his public relations, legal, accounting, and finance committees. Jack Anderson and Lewis Simpson served as co-chairman of the Advanced Solicitation Committee. Now, I was privileged to serve with both of those men. My responsibility was to speak before groups wanting information about the project, hold coffees, and help with the initial fundraising efforts, while at the same time I continued to help my husband raise our family. Report sessions for the fund drive brought workers together at 9:09 p.m. 909 was a significant number because it represented the formula upon which the entire investment fund drive was based. If Anchorage raised the first $500,000, 9 times that amount was pledged to be forthcoming from the then lower 48. As a high-ranking official with the National Board of Missions, Dr. Gould continued to personally inspire hundreds of stateside Methodist congregations to participate in the effort and caused a delegation to come to Anchorage from all parts of the United States to help with the college project. Maynard Taylor, who was mayor of the city then in March of 1955, was mightily impressed by the group's arrival. He was quoted in one local newspaper as saying, "Here we have emissaries of goodwill with open minds from all areas in the states, people of far-reaching influence coming here to see, learn, and take back their findings. They come at no expense to Alaska and with no axe to grind. They come with a gift in their hands, the promise of a 4-year non-sectarian liberal arts college if Anchorage will raise the first $500,000. Taylor called this an opportunity for Alaska, not only to gain a great college, but to present the true story of its assets and opportunities, its people, its future throughout the United States. $125,000 in pledges, about 1/3 of Anchorage's goal, had been accounted for by the time the Methodist delegation arrived. The rest of the $500,000 local share was to come from general subscriptions, from men and women's organizations, and groups who saw the college in their midst as a golden opportunity for all of Alaska, their families, and their future. Less than 1 month later, in April of 1955, the local pledge drive had exceeded its fundraising goal. In a publicized letter to the community, Chairman Arthur Waldron said, "All faiths and all nationalities were investors in the college, as were all ranges of income and livelihood. No gift was too small. All of those who gave of their time and talents were founders, and they are a part of this educational investment in our future." He went on to say, "Their lasting thanks will come from all the generations of students and teachers who will follow." On June 29, 1958, Anchorage citizens and Methodist visitors gathered together on a picturesque hill facing the Chugach Range to dedicate the campus of Alaska Methodist University. The following day, June 30th, 1958, Alaska gained statehood when the Senate gave its final congressional approval. Statehood for Alaska fired up universal interest in this part of the world. People were not only interested in hearing about the 49th state, but were anxious to help with its development. One could say the struggles for each ultimately benefited both in reaching their goals. The first brochure sent by Alaska Methodist University to prospective students challenged them to make history, attend AMU. The idea of making history was appealing, and hundreds of college-bound youth responded. They wanted to participate, even though the university hadn't yet formally opened its doors. What kinds of information will appeal to students entering college in the years ahead? Will they gravitate toward institutions of higher learning offering courses of study that address conditions associated with the ever-changing workplace? Will college programs be designed to give students the comprehensive information they will need to function in a computerized world? Almost everyone agrees the world will be a very different place in the future. But what about the past? How do we feel about the past? Will it be forgotten? I think not. All across the nation, there is a deep and abiding effort to remember the past and those pioneers who laid the foundation for the establishment of churches, homes, schools, businesses, universities, libraries, and parks. Those structures and places will, if maintained, continue to connect our societies with their pasts and thereby engender lasting pride and respect. What of Anchorage? It still retains all of the right ingredients that enable it to become one of the finer, safe, and sane northern cities of the world. Because of its past achievements and its unique natural attributes, Anchorage should never have to copy the themes of other cities in order to achieve status and become a memorable place. It has made a great beginning, and it should continue to be enjoyed, respected, and remembered in all of the years yet to come. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Mrs. Crittenden.
Our future, as it affects this university and the city in which we live.
Our next presenter is Dr. McGinnis, one of the presidents of the university and one of the members of the Committee of 100, also one deeply involved in the legislative and governmental life of our state, comes in eminently qualified to speak to us from those dual points of view of the university and the development of our state.
Good morning. Long before Alaska became a state, and long before the Methodist Church was founded in the 1700s, the Church Universal had become the mother of education at all levels. In the early centuries of history, the monks in the monasteries, by candlelight, transcribing the wisdom of the then present and the then past, to teach the generations to come, passed on the educational heritage of that civilization in each century, which has transpired from then until now. So it's not unusual that the Methodist Church, along with other great Christian denominations and indeed other religious bodies, have given enormously strong emphasis to education at all levels, including universities and colleges. The Methodist Church, rich in its heritage, of course followed in that stream which had been initiated centuries before the founding of Methodism as a great denomination in this country. In 1784, Bishop Francis Asbury decided there should be a college at Abingdon, Maryland. He founded the college and got it going. After 1 year, an arsonist burned it down to the ground. Not to be discouraged, he decided to go over to Baltimore and open another Methodist college. And an arsonist came along and burned it down, whereupon Bishop Asbury concluded, and I quote his words, "It seems not to be God's will that the Methodists should have colleges." Now imagine that kind of theology on the part of a bishop. It wasn't God's will he was talking about. The most trouble he had was a couple arsonists, maybe the same one. Had nothing to do with God's will, which later was to be revealed in the establishment of universities as the pioneering territories opened across the nation, When the frontiers began to break down and the citizens came west, the church with its mission and all of its dimensions went west as well, and colleges as well as churches were formulated. 11 times in the history of the United States, the Methodist Church went out into the territories prior to the time that statehood had been granted by those territories and opened the universities to nourish the life, the educational, emotional, spiritual, developmental life of the society and certainly of individuals. About 40 years ago to this very day, here in the city of Anchorage, there was a Methodist conference held in its tradition of annual meetings, and it met at the new Baxter Methodist Church here in the city. Bishop Bruce Baxter presided over that conference. To that conference came 3 outstanding Methodists. One was Dr. Earl Brown, the executive secretary of the Board of Missions of the Methodist Church, was present. With him was Dr. John O. Gross, the executive secretary of the General Board of Education of the Methodist Church. And Gordon Gould, beloved to all of us, was present at that conference. He had gone with the Board of Missions 1 year before that in 48. And in 49, he was present at the meeting here in Anchorage 40 years ago, not 30. I'm speaking of the right decade, 40 years rather than 30 years. And at that meeting, the primary part of it had to do with education and the mission of the church. Dr. Earl Brown spoke first on the agenda, introduced by Bishop Baxter. And he outlined the role of missions in the founding of churches, in the founding of universities for the church. Then came that other important dimension of the life of the church, the educational wing. Dr. John O. Gross, a predecessor of Dr. Trotter in the position from which he comes. And he outlined the strong commitment. And of course, we all know and value, love, and appreciate the time, the energy, the devotion, the dream, the aspirations of Peter Gordon Gould in helping that dream come true. My life first intertwined with Mr. Gould as early as 1949, about a year after he had been assigned to the post. We corresponded with each other long before I came to Alaska. It had to do with the college. It had to do with the Methodist program in the state. And then in 1950, that did result in the fact that I came up here. So those 2 leaders, 3 in all, infusing the best in the mission outreach of the church and the best in higher educational philosophy, joined together, and at this place in geography, and at that time in history, those influences came together in order to make the dream of a college for Alaska come about. John Gross said at that meeting, quote, "Alaska's most significant need is the establishment of a church-related liberal arts college." And a host of other devoted men and women began to catch that dream after the 1948-49 years and as we moved into 1950. I should like briefly now to turn my attention to what I would like to call, if you will indulge me for a moment, what I would call the role of honor. Some of these people are well known to all of you, but some of them had enormous obligations, pressures, commitments, dreams, aspiration, all of which contributed to the founding of this school and the Methodist activity in Alaska generally. I won't comment on these names, but just simply sound them because I would be a renegade, I think, to my duties and my understanding of history to ignore them. One is A. Raymond Grant, Earl Brown, Bishop Everett Palmer, Dr. John Gross, Mr. William Vernon Middleton, who later became the Bishop Middleton, George Hergesheimer, Conwell Snoke, the keepers of the purses of the Board of Missions, those 2 great men, Chester Alter, the educator, Myron Wicke, I believe the immediate predecessor to Dr. Trotter in his position, devoted, prayerfully, workfully, everlastingly committed to the well-being of this institution. And then there's a man by the name of Dr. Roy Johns. You've probably never heard of Roy Johns, most of you. Roy Johns quietly went about cultivation in the Methodist Church and was responsible for millions of dollars that came into the treasury of the national missions by the efforts of Roy Johns. In Alaska, you've heard some of the roll of honor. I would like to add to those Earl Hillstrand, John Conley, that devoted trustee, marvelous friend, Lewis Simpson, Jack Anderson, Art Waldron, Taylor Marshall, with us today, John Crowell, George Sharrock, Ken Hinchy. These were individuals with dreams and aspirations, and they rolled up their sleeves and did what needed to be done in order to see that this school came about. The charter was written by John Conley and Wendell Kay. Some of you who knew and loved Wendell thought a rather unlikely prospect to be writing a charter for the Christian college, but in an upper room by the downtown post office at G Street and 4th Avenue, one day, throughout the whole day, John Conley, Wendell Kay, and I sat and we outlined the basic articles of incorporation for this particular school. Later, sent to the Board of Missions, ratified by the Board of Missions. It became the Articles of Incorporation, and the bylaws then were developed in order to launch it, and I believe has gone rather untouched except for a few words amendment from that day until this day. Meredith Groves, E.D. MacDonald, Vernon Middleton, Conwell Snow, George Steed, and Myron Wicke. 16 given the responsibility to go into the launch orbit. First official meeting in May of 1957, Bishop Grant was elected to chairman of the board and served in that capacity without interruption until the day of his death, some decade or more later. My own involvement began in 1954 when moving from Juneau to Anchorage, being assigned, even then, the assistant superintendent of Methodist work in Alaska, then becoming superintendent in 57. About a fourth of the time during the superintendency days and substantial time during the dual pastorate at First Church Anchorage and with the university involvement. Then, of course, after 1957, full-time as superintendent, and then in 1959, when it was my honor to be asked to lead the university as its president. This university is so well conceived and given a healthy birth. It served well the purposes for which it was lovingly and passionately created. Her sons and daughters have gone forth to serve some of Alaska's greatest social needs, health needs, education, spiritual, cultural. Doctors, lawyers, teachers, legislators, business executives, homemakers, along those other numerous pathways that these persons have gone. Since being in Anchorage in the last day or two and reading the daily newspaper, I saw names of 3 or 4 individuals that jumped out at me. They're now serving in the legislature. And each of those individuals a product of Alaska Methodist University, I believe prior to the time. Yes, it would have been part of the time that the name was changed, but in any event, products of this university. When a taxi driver was driving past here in Washington, D.C., they went by the National Archives building, and the passenger saw what was engraved on the building. And you remember, those of you who know the National Archives buildings and memorize what these engravings are, said simply, "What is past is prologue." The passenger said to the taxi driver, "What does that mean? The past is prologue." The taxi driver said, "I've seen that many times. I'm not sure what it means, but I think it means you ain't seen nothing yet." And I should like to say that Alaska Pacific University, now at a very distinguished part of its career, I don't believe we've begun to see anything yet. I will be a little bit more grammatical than the taxi driver. But I believe that the best years are ahead. My faith in Alaska is absolutely unbounded, undaunted by some of the recent problems that faced it. Alaskans have always faced problems. I was only here 30 years or so. And I know these Alaskans face to face, from the Juneau place, in the government world, in the private world, in the church world, in the school world, in the university world. These Alaskans do not know defeat. And they will have ways, and they have had ways, to do the things that need to do to take this university to higher levels even before. When Bishop Grant was the chairman of the board here in Anchorage on one occasion, he delivered a great sermon, and those of you who knew him knew that he was an orator of the rather first order. I have never forgotten the 3 points that he made in that great address in this city. The first point was, there is no living without belonging, in which he talked about the interrelationships and the necessity of life to the interrelationships and a sense of belonging. He said there is no living without belonging, and he waxed eloquent. His next point was, there is no belonging without involvement. He talked about the sins of individuals who believed that they could belong to the human race and to fraternities and organizations and just simply not get involved. And for 15 minutes he extolled there is no belonging without involvement. And then he moved to his third point, there is no involvement without commitment, real commitment. And I've thought of those words over and over again of that great leader. No living without belonging. No belonging without involvement. No involvement without commitment. And I believe those words to be as true today as they were then. I'd like to close these remarks by reminding you of a quotation from John Ruskin. When I became president of the university, I knew of this, and I had it framed and placed in the president's office so that every day from the day the school opened for classes until more than a decade when I left, I saw that every time I went in the office and out of the office. I hope it's around somewhere. It's about that big, about that big. And this is what it says, a quotation, direct quotation of John Ruskin. Therefore, when we build, let us think that we build forever. Therefore, when we build, let us think that we build forever. Let it not be for present use alone. Let it be such work as our descendants will thank us for. And let us think as we lay stone on stone, that a time is to come when these stones will be held sacred because our hands have touched them. And that men will say, as they look at the wrought substance of our labors, look what our fathers did for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. McGinnis. I now present to you Dr. Richard Gay, the first faculty of Alaska Methodist University, professor of religion and philosophy, and also the chaplain, and subsequent to that, the vice president of the university.
The reference to Wendell Kay reminded me that Wendell Kay was himself a graduate of DePaul University, a first-rate Methodist-related school in Greencastle, Indiana. And as I came to know Wendell through the years, he continued to express, as he did in serving, as Fred mentioned, he continued to express his appreciation for the quality of higher education that he had himself experienced as an undergraduate at DePaul. To attend one of these schools is to have an impact made upon you so that you never really escape that experience. Now, my association with Alaska Methodist University began in a fascinating, if not providential way. When I finished Drew, well, earlier than that, I think I can say that the first sermon I ever really heard so that it made an impact upon me was delivered in my home church in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, when William Vernon Middleton, who was then the executive secretary of the City Missionary Society of the Philadelphia Annual Conference, when he came as a guest preacher to First Methodist Church. And he was fascinating and able. And as I say, I believe really it was the first existential experience of really listening to a sermon in my life. I was a high school student at the time. And I said to myself, if ever I were drawn toward the ministry, I would want something of the style of that man. Well, I did go on through college and then into theological school, attended Drew University School of Theology, and upon graduation was appointed to a church in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And lo and behold, it was the first church that William Vernon Middleton had served in his career, though I did not know that until I arrived as the minister of that little church. And once again, our ways had crossed. Through the years, I followed his move as he moved toward national leadership, and I had no idea that he paid any attention to what had become of me, because we had had just infrequent meetings. But it was on a flight between Columbus, Ohio, and Chicago that I encountered William Vernon Middleton on that same flight. He knew exactly where I was and what I was doing. By that time, I had become the assistant to the president of Ohio Wesleyan University in Delaware, Ohio, and was also teaching religion and serving as chaplain of the university. And he cross-examined me at length during that flight about my ideas and my values and my commitments and so forth. And I thought it was simply a kind of a fatherly interest in me, and thought no more about it. But in December of 1958, a letter came from room 102 of the Anchorage Hotel, Anchorage, Alaska, signed by Donald F. Ebright, in which Donald Ebright, the first president of Alaska Methodist University, said, "A mutual friend of ours, William Vernon Middleton, has suggested that we should give serious consideration to inviting you to become the first professor of philosophy and religion and chaplain of Alaska Methodist University. Would you be interested?" I wrote back saying I was terribly happy at Ohio Wesleyan University and really was not interested. But I remembered that before I went to Ohio Wesleyan, I was the associate minister of the First Methodist Church in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and the Women's Society there had been very active in promoting monies for Alaska Methodist College. Now, it was one of many interests. That church was very mission-minded. They had been highly supportive of the Jesse Lee Home, which was a women's missionary project. Mrs. P.N. Jones and Mrs. Penny, Hazel Penny and others, they were always after something. And so I simply thought, well, Alaska, that's just their latest thing, that's all. And little knowing, not knowing at all that it would be occupying 30 or more years of my life in one way or another. So this letter from Dr. Ebright connected with the little I'd heard about Alaska Methodist College, which preceded statehood. Well, we had never camped. I'm not an outdoor kind of person, still not converted to it, even though living here for many years. But we decided we'd go to Sears Roebuck and buy a tent and come up and see what Alaska looked like, not knowing it was so far away, and with four young children. So under the guise of going to a conference at Estes Park, Colorado, we went on further and came to Alaska in July of 1959. So in July of 59, we were on this campus, and there was a labor strike, and the building wasn't completed, and it had been raining for days, and it was muddy, and one of our children lost her shoes in the mud and so forth. So we saw the campus 12 years after George Sharrock described it in 1947. We saw it in 59. There was no sun like this beautiful day, and we were very discouraged, and my wife and I made the decision we don't want any part of this project. Ohio Wesleyan looked even more beautiful than it ever had before. Besides, I had tenure. And so I wrote back to Donald Ebright that I wasn't interested. I'm sorry if it disappointed my good friend William Vernon Middleton, but I really wasn't interested. But Donald Ebright continued to write. Then finally he wrote and said, "I'm coming to the inauguration of the new president of Ohio Wesleyan University. I understand you're the chairman of the festivities." He'd learned that somehow, and I said, "Yes, I am." And he had said, "Could I possibly stay with you while he said, "We work from a limited budget. Could I stay in your residence while I'm in Delaware, Ohio?" So I said, of course, that he could. Well, during that time, he spent most of the time trying to sell me again, over and over and over again, on coming up to Alaska Methodist University. Finally, as I've told the story before, finally I did accept the invitation to come because I said that my most well-received speech in Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Ohio, particularly commencement season, baccalaureate season, was "Life is a challenge." And I knew I could never give that again if I said I couldn't help it. Or that if I did give it, it would be hypocritical. So I had talked myself into accepting the challenge and accepted the invitation to come. In the meantime, there was whatever there was up here as concerns administration and presidential leadership. And Donald E. Bright was gone, and a new president was announced, Dr. Fred McGinnis. Now, I had mixed feelings. My first feeling was maybe I can get out of this now because of the change in administration, because maybe they won't even want to pick up the lead that was out there by the first president. So I fully expected I would receive a communication which would give me an out, that I could say that I didn't have to come, or I'd be told that the previous invitations were not going to be honored. But I was to find out then that that's not the kind of man Dr. Fred McGinnis is, because I got a wonderful letter from him saying nothing has changed, the administration may have changed, and I am now the president, so on and so forth. But those of you who have been invited, we want you to come. The research has been done. We're satisfied from what we've read that you're the kinds of people that we want to be a part of the original faculty. So Fred cut off my escape. And so the speech and the letter confirmed that we were to come, and we did come. We flew up on George Sharrock's PNA plane out of Seattle, about an 8-hour flight and so forth, and arrived. Our house wasn't done, but eventually it was finished and so forth. Now, I developed a more sophisticated reason for coming here, and it goes something like this. That I was a product of a church-related college, though not of the Methodist denomination, although I was a Methodist. I had seen the impact that, as a history major, that church-related colleges had made in the East Coast and in the Midwest and elsewhere. And so it was a very appealing thing to think that I could be a part of an enterprise here that would make the kind of impact in this territory that those schools had made across the years. What a wonderful privilege to be a part of an institution of higher education that would make an impact comparable to what these other schools had made in the history of our country and the history of higher education. And for the 15 years that I was on the faculty of Alaska Methodist University, and now since, I've been able to observe that that came true. For as Fred said, he picked up the paper and saw 3 or 4 names of people who were exercising leadership, in this case in conjunction with the legislature. Well, I just jotted down names that I could give, but instead I'll give their disciplines. In the course of the years that I've been associated with this university, people have emerged from this school who are now leaders in law, government, medicine, business, finance, family life, entrepreneurship, citizenship, education, religion, the arts, athletics, and the helping services. This school has released to the state as well as to the area those persons who have made an impact comparable to the kind of impact that has been made in other parts of our country as a result of this kind of education. The question is always raised, and it's a very difficult one, as to why a denomination should support a college, why they should give money if it's not in the business of turning out their products. So always, both at Ohio Wesleyan and here, I had to constantly deal in the administrative relationships with people who would listen to you say these wonderful things about the quality of people that schools will produce. But someone in the back of the room always wanted to raise the hand, but are you making them Christians? Are you making them Methodists? For after all, in a market enterprise community, the idea is, why should we put money in this if we're not turning out some of those who will come back to our institution, be on our boards, and supply money, and so forth? Not once in the evolution of this school did I encounter in its supporters, its administrators, and others, the idea that this school had no right to exist unless it produced, by proselytizing, those who would in some way benefit the institution which had brought it into being. It's a unique experience, probably the most unique experience in a market-oriented society, to be in something that is held responsible for quality and not for producing something that justifies its existence on a cost-effective basis. That, of course, makes it difficult, and that's one of the reasons why I thought that my midlife crisis really had come back in '75, when it appeared that we had run out of steam. No, we'd run out of money. No, we'd run out of future. We simply could not go on. To listen to stories of students who'd say such things as this: I'd love to go to your college. It's a marvelous school. It's a beautiful campus. It's fabulous. But you see, I can stay home, keep my Trans Am, and pay $20 a credit hour. And that, in miniature, was what we heard at a time when there was yet another alternative, and it was less costly than it was necessary to charge for a school of this sort. I have never really heard the school put down qualitatively. It is always praised qualitatively. Now, what is the heart of this kind of a school, then? Well, this is my own formula. It is the case that the Methodists seem to be committed to this proposition, that religion ought not so much to be a matter of doing or not doing certain things, but more a matter of a certain way of doing everything. And if you look for a textual way to justify that, you can turn to the quote which is attributed to Jesus, which goes like this: I am come that they might have life, and that they might have it more abundantly. At its best, a church-related college, and hopefully Methodist church-related colleges, it seems to me, are committed to that proposition, that life must and may be enriched by the quality of relationship and scholarship and understanding and compassion and all those good things which can prevail in an institution which does not have as its primary objective a cost-effective turning out some little copy. The variety, the diversity, the depth which a first-rate school such as this has been able to make available. Now, I have been privileged to speak a little bit about the present and the future. I have been privileged in the last couple of years to be invited back to teach a course every now and then. We all know what a massager Glenn Oles was. Well, he massaged me and got me to come back into the circle again. His way of putting it was, in my entire career as a professor, I have never allowed anyone to teach one of my